So I think that we've all been in that same situation where you're 22 years old and you head off to Europe for the first time with a bunch of Australian guys. And you go to London, you go to Madrid, you go to Berlin, and then you end up in the northern German city of Hamburg, where one night you're drinking with your friends, and inside the hostel there are these three Spanish girls, one of which is an INFJ personality type. And because perhaps you're an INFP personality type, you find this INFJ girl to have quite a dark allure. And so the next night when you all hang out in a group together and you go to the Reeperbahn district and get very, very drunk, a romance develops between you and this INFJ girl, the likes of which you've never experienced in your entire life. And so there are finally some tears when you have to part ways, and she heads off with her Spanish friends to go to Berlin, and you and your Australian friends head off to Amsterdam to trip your nuts off on magic mushrooms. However, when you finally return to Australia and you're living with your dad and you've got no job, no money and no prospects, you're quite delighted to find that this INFJ Spanish girl starts messaging you on your MySpace account. And because you're a young INFP and she's a young INFJ, you do have a bit of a propensity to idealize the other person, and the long distance online relationship very much continues along these lines. You think of her as this perfect INFJ girl that you can travel overseas and marry and be with for the rest of your life, and she starts sending paintings that she's done of you and she's put up on her bedroom wall, and you start sending her songs that you've done and sending them across to her, and it is admittedly all quite lovely. However, the only problem is that you're living with your dad, and he, just like this Spanish girl, happens to be an INFJ personality type. And one night you make the mistake of showing a photo of you and this girl together that you had taken back in Hamburg. And this causes your dad to start having idealization issues of his own. He starts getting overly excited about the idea of having an INFJ daughter-in-law. And before long, it all gets a little bit confusing. Your dad's always knocking on your door every morning asking about the last time that you talked to that beautiful Spanish girl. Every time you come home from seeing your friends, your INFJ dad is playing romantic Spanish ballads from the 1970s. Even though the INFJ girl from Spain that you're supposed to be idealizing is actually much more of a fan of post-punk music from the UK. And even though you do eventually get a job and you save up your money and you go and fly to Chicago of all places because that's where she's studying during this time, you do reignite the relationship with her and it's all very romantic, but then she tells you one day that you need to be with many, many other women and that you're not hairy enough for her. And so you're very hurt by this and you go and mope around in New York by yourself, you mope around in Montreal by yourself, you go to San Francisco and you start moping around as well. And then you come across this young ENFP guy that's in your hostel and you become friends with him and you hang out with him, and he sees photos of you and this girl together and he demands that you go back to Chicago and tell her how you really feel. And so you go and do that and you tell her how you really feel, and then you end up being invited back to a student dorm for a little while, and then it's all very romantic for a while, and then it all sort of comes crashing down and you head back to Australia and the relationship basically fizzles out over the next year. And even though you're a little bit sad and a little bit heartbroken, you do find it easier to move on when you end up back in Australia, which unfortunately cannot be said for your INFJ father, who now has to contend with living in a world where he is no longer going to have an INFJ Spanish daughter-in-law. In fact, to add insult to injury, within a few weeks you start dating a new girl who, instead of being an INFJ personality type, is an INFP personality type, which, as you can imagine, to an INFJ father dead set on an INFJ Spanish daughter-in-law, is a slap in the face. And even though you and your INFP girlfriend, who is from Japan and is actually going to be leaving quite soon, leaving behind a new kind of heartbreak, he just doesn't seem to have quite the same sort of romantic excitement towards her. He likes her, he gets on well with her, he thinks she's really nice, but she's never going to be a Spanish INFJ. And in fact, there is not a single occasion when you come home to find your dad playing romantic Japanese music from the 1970s, or indeed any decade for that matter. And then when many years pass and you're working in a soul-destroying office job and you make an INFJ friend, he ends up being somewhat of an INFJ dad to you as well. Even though he's actually only 1 year older than you, that's sort of enough to make him your dad if you really think about it. And one day you get this message out of the blue from this INFJ Turkish girl that you had met about 5 years before. And perhaps one night she had had some drinks or something, because this INFJ Turkish girl who you barely know tells you that you should fly to Turkey to meet her one day. And you show this message to this INFJ friend of yours that you work with in the office, because you had always used her as an example of a very cool Turkish girl that is on your Facebook. And so because you're going to Europe anyway, you actually end up flying one day from Belarus to Turkey via Lithuania, and you go and meet this INFJ Turkish girl. And even though when you meet her at the airport in southern Turkey, she's a little bit awkward and snaps at you for some reason, she has a lot of these friends who come up to you and pinch your cheek and make you feel very welcome and at home in Turkey. And then one day she drives you to this mountain and you end up in a treehouse together, and things between you and her end up being a little bit more relaxed, and she opens up to you and tells you that she's very comfortable with you, which makes you feel very good as an INFP. And even though nothing actually does end up happening between you and her because she's living a very complicated life, and to some degree so are you, and even though you take a little bit of time to readjust and you're also feeling a little bit sad and a little bit heartbroken, it can be argued that once again you're not really taking into account the heartache that your INFJ friend in Australia, who is married with kids, was to end up feeling, knowing that his INFP friend who he works with in the government is not going to end up in a relationship with a beautiful INFJ Turkish girl. Now, before I finish this video, I do need to confess something to you. That young man that I was talking about in this video was me. I was the young INFP who went off with his friends to Europe. I was the young INFP who ended up going to America to see the INFJ. I was the INFP who even went over to Turkey and stayed in a treehouse. It was all me. But now it's time to turn the spotlight on you. Are you an INFP or are you an INFJ? Let me know in the comments whether you over-idealize your partners or the partners of those around you. And do you find that sometimes the idealization doesn't necessarily match with reality? Or do you think sometimes a bit of idealization is good to add a bit of flavor and romance? I've personally found that when I idealize someone, often when I meet them in real life and form a real relationship with them, I actually end up liking them more than the person I was idealizing. That's actually an experience I've had which makes me feel like idealization doesn't have to be a bad thing. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments and I'll see you next time.